Mind Your Farm Business on realagriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I'm Shaun Haney. I'm your host today here on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, and you can find more episodes at mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Financial health is so important to a farm business, but it's not the only health that's critical to the success on the farm. How much have you considered mental health on your farm? I can tell you that farmers across the country are talking about mental health in agriculture at a much higher frequency than ever before. Now, we all know that farming is stressful. It involves variables like weather, markets, and even family. Some very unpredictable variables indeed. Today, we're going to dive deep into the issue of mental health in agriculture with an expert on the subject. Dr. Andria Jones-Bitton is going to shed some light on this very difficult topic that impacts farms across Canada and what we can do to tackle it head on. Andrea, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Shaun. How are you?
I'm doing really well. This is such an important topic. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Give the audience your background and what you do.
Well, I'm a veterinarian and I'm an epidemiologist, which means I study health and disease in populations. And back in fall 2015, out of growing concern for hearing about mental health issues facing our farmers, I turned my research focus towards looking at mental health and wellness in farmers.
Now, a lot of times we hear in marketing that, but agriculture is different. And in most cases, it's not. When we talk about stress and mental health and the issues that are all under this umbrella, we're really finding out that farming is no different than any other industry. It's real, and it's creating it has impacts on the people that are in our industry.
It definitely does. And I would argue, while there are many similarities between farmers and, say, other business owners, I think also the variety of stresses that farmers experience and the fact that many of them are outside of their control, as well as this family history or legacy behind a lot of farms, does probably put them in their own category.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Because of those variables outside of a farmer's personal control, are we seeing higher rate of issues of mental health in other industries?
It's likely a contributing factor. So we know when we experience hopelessness, that it can increase our vulnerability to chronic effects of stress as well as mental health issues. And when we look at some of the major stressors that farmers experience, like impacts of weather and the far-reaching impacts that has, changing government regulations, anti-agriculture activism, a lot of those things are beyond a farmer's control, which can increase those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, which can make them more susceptible to mental illness.
Now, what is the context of this? Because there is obviously varying degrees, right? So a lot of times when we talk about this subject, some people, I think, ignore it because they think of the extreme worst examples, heaven forbid, like suicide. But there's a whole bunch of things that are before that that count and need to be considered as well.
Definitely, and you're right. There's a continuum of both mental illness and a continuum of wellness as well, such that we can have somebody who has a clinical diagnosis of depression, but is managing it very well and is actually high on the wellness continuum. Alternately, we could have somebody who might not be clinically depressed, but they themselves could be very low on the wellness continuum. So you're absolutely right that it's not cut and dry. Some of the impacts of chronic stress, even if they don't actually amount to, say, a clinical diagnosis, they can still have very serious impacts on our lives. And so we know that chronic stress is associated with poor physical health. It's associated with poor quality of life. It's associated with procrastination, decreased productivity. And so even without a mental illness diagnosis, we can still have some serious effects both on our mental and physical health, as well as our relationships, both business relationships and personal relationships. So the effects can be pretty far-reaching.
How much of a factor is the fact that a lot of farmers and ranchers are by themselves a lot? Does that at all play a role in this?
I would think so, yeah. So social isolation is an important consideration. Humans are social creatures. Even the most introverted among us do need connections with others, and support networks are very important. We know high quality relationships and social support is associated with happiness and well-being. So definitely that has an impact. And as farms have gotten bigger and perhaps more spread out, some are wondering, has that increased the social isolation that farmers are experiencing? Social media, on one hand, can be very good in that it can connect farmers. Ag Twitter is usually all a tweet, and people are connecting that way. At the same time, there can be a dark side associated with social media as well, where it actually just does the opposite and serves to increase our stress.
So some of the audience listening is probably like, okay, yeah, I get together with some of my neighbors in the coffee shop, maybe every morning, maybe every once a week. Even if I was dealing with some of these stresses and pressures, and maybe I thought I was a little bit depressed, that I'm not bringing it up to that group, because there's some social norms historically that are in place that create walls, so to speak, on getting people to talk about these things.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think particularly in agriculture, the history or the culture in agriculture has been not to talk about these things. We see that changing in sort of general society. Even just a few generations ago, if somebody had a mental illness, they might be quote unquote sent away. And so it wasn't surprising, really, that people didn't want to openly talk about some of the struggles they might be experiencing with mental health. Again, that is changing, and as people talk more openly about it and stigma is being reduced, I think that's what a lot of the initiatives in agriculture right now are working towards, is changing that culture in agriculture, where struggles with our mental health or mental illness aren't seen as character flaws or weaknesses, but are rather just another type of illness or another regular part of life that we deal with. So hopefully we see that changing. Do More Agriculture has been great at getting people in ag to talk about their mental health. We have a couple of mental health literacy training programs right now that are training people how to recognize signs or symptoms that somebody might be struggling. So if you or I were sitting in the coffee shop and I noticed that you weren't quite yourself, maybe you wouldn't have to bring it up. Maybe I could bring it up and see if you felt like engaging with me on that. So hopefully with this training, we'll start to see the dialogue increase.
So the lack of control over the variables that we deal with, whether we're in livestock or we're in farming, those variables are likely not to change. The weather is one example. The other component of this that you talked about was more of the family business component, I think is what you said. Can you allude to or elaborate on that a little bit?
Definitely. So family, again, is sort of, it's got a bright side and a dark side, it appears, in farming. And we are currently analyzing some research data that we collected via interviews, one-on-one interviews with farmers and people working in the agricultural industry. So family can be great in that it's a support network. Oftentimes, communication lines can be quite open, and so that can be replenishing and can be a good thing in a farmer's life. At the same time, we can also have situations where that just increases the already present stresses and exacerbates them, where we come into relationships with a whole lot of history or baggage or perhaps poor communication. And so in this instance, where we have people who might be struggling with their mental health, mental health in any family unit affects the family as a whole. And in this case, we also have family members who are business partners or employees or employers. So that's one element of it. There's also this family history piece that is coming through loud and clear in our research data, where there's this additional pressure that farmers are experiencing when they know that the farm or the land has been in the family for generations. And we hear people talk about, their great-grandfather literally clearing the land, with a horse and sort of establishing their business on that land. And so there's an additional pressure of not being the generation that loses it all. And so there's the business side and the finances side that, any business owner would be dealing with. And then there's also this emotional connection to place and an emotional connection to the land and to the family legacy behind it that I think raises the bar that much more.
Well, that one's real, because you have a situation where you have all these variables out of your control, and then the fact is that's stressful. And trying to, be financially sustainable, but you may not even want to be there in the first place, which creates a whole nother level of stress. That's like a double whammy, but it's a real and I know some people probably listening are like, well, if you don't want to do it, then get out. Easier. It's like sort of like the mafia at times. Easier said than done.
Well, I hope not quite that far. I just finished watching Sopranos, and I hope it's not like that. But yeah, there is definitely, a sense of familial responsibility. Succession planning is such an important part of farm business management, and keeping those lines of communication open. We do have younger generations of farmers who are talking with us saying, I don't know if I want to take over the family farm, but I'm feeling all this pressure from my parents to do that because they've worked so hard. And again, the farm's been in the family for generations, so what happens if I step away? And that is a lot of additional pressure on someone.
We're going to continue my conversation with Andria Jones-Bitton, but first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of Mind Your Farm Business Podcast is brought to you by RBC. While there is no way to eliminate all business risks you'll face, creating a sound risk management strategy will help mitigate some of the more common ones and give your business a leg up. The agriculture account managers at RBC can help you set your farm up for success. Visit rbc.com/agriculture to find an ag specialist near you. Okay, so on a past episode of Mind Your Farm Business, our guest was Chip Eichelberger, and Chip talked a lot about how in order to take care of your business, you got to take care of yourself first. And he talked about eating right, and he talked about exercise and how that has a whole bunch of positive benefits to dealing with stress and operating your farm business. A lot of times to create awareness about this issue, talking about it seems to be the thing that gets the most focus. But just talking about it isn't necessarily dealing with some of the root causes. Is that fair or unfair?
I would say that's fair. Talking about it is a necessary first step to bring awareness and to hopefully I don't want to use the word convince, but perhaps convince somebody that taking care of themselves is important. And Chip is right. It's absolutely crucial that we look after our well-being in order to remain productive and to function optimally. With that, of course, is absolutely everyone knows what it takes to be healthy, right? We all know that we need good quality sleep and that we need to eat nutritious foods and that we need to be physically active. The problem is, talking about it doesn't make those things happen. And so what we need actually is habit change and even a culture change in agriculture where we do start to actually walk the walk and start to take care of ourselves better. And that is the harder part.
I'll give you a personal example, and I'll switch out mental health for procrastination. Okay. Personally, I'm a terrible procrastinator, and I talk about it. I'm aware of it. I'm talking to you in the audience right now, admitting I have a procrastination problem. That doesn't mean I'm changing the habit to actually fix it, right? I may have the best of intentions, but until I actually deal with the issue and make some changes in how I tackle a task list on a weekly, monthly, daily basis, I shouldn't expect any different of a result. And I think if you take procrastination and switch back to mental health, it's probably the same. It's the same issue, right?
Absolutely. And the procrastination probably is likely impacting at least your mental wellness, Shaun, so I would encourage you to work on that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Self-awareness is really important. We have to recognize in your example that procrastination is causing an issue. And then that, again, that's the critical first piece, but then we have to do something about it. And behavior change, unfortunately, can be difficult for a lot of people, myself included. But there are also things that we can do about that. And so setting goals, establishing a plan to meet them. We talked about hope earlier. Well, hope is having concrete goals, agency or belief that you have the capacity to achieve those goals, and then creating pathways so that we can help achieve those goals. So that's where pen meets paper, and we start to say, okay, so what are some things that I can do here to help address this habit that I want to change? There's a great book, I think it was a New York Times bestseller called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And it's an excellent look. It's a fairly easy read. It's an excellent look at the human brain and how we establish habits that may or may not serve us, and then what we can do to replace those habits. Because we can't ever get rid of a bad habit. We can only replace it with a better one.
Yeah, you're right, and you can. That's a great book. I actually have it on my Goodreads to read list. I need to not procrastinate and get to that book. To see what I did there? I see. Yeah, tying it all together.
Wow.
So some of these things we can't escape, and so creating mechanisms and being self-aware and realizing, okay, here's what I need to do to combat or deal or work through this. They're really critical. I had mentioned exercise. You had mentioned the habit portion of it. Are there other things that fit into this equation to help listeners out?
Well, I think what I've been working on in some workshops with farmers is there's lots of different models out there. The one that we've been using is the 8 domains of wellness. And it kind of looks at 8 areas of our life that help contribute to our well-being. And that can be really overwhelming. A lot of us are already feeling very busy and very overwhelmed. And then here I stand on this stage and say, well, now you also have to do things in these 8 other areas of your life, right? And so I get that can be difficult. And so I think farmers are very creative and they're very ingenious. And especially when you get them in a room together to start talking about ways to, quote unquote, fix problems, really amazing things come out. And so I say, okay, well, your physical activity, you've identified as being low and there's areas for improvement. So what can you actually do to help increase your physical activity? So example of a poor goal would be, well, I'm going to start going to the gym for an hour a day, 5 days a week, right? If you're currently going 0 times a week, that's not a very good goal. Because it's unrealistic, and then you're likely to fail at it. And if you fail at it, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so you don't want to do it again. And so these farmers will say, well, okay, like what can we do to increase our physical activity? So maybe instead of taking the quad or the truck from barn to barn, maybe I can go back to walking it, right? Or maybe after dinner, I can walk the fence lines, again, not to do work, but I can get some physical activity, maybe go with my partner or take the dog. And so now I'm getting some more physical activity that way, and you're also connecting it with your social wellness by connecting with another human. So I think the most important thing is deciding, okay, this is an area I want to do something about, and then coming up with a strategy that's actually feasible. And even if it's a tiny first step, that tiny first step will work to a second step, right? I think it's too easy to want to take on too much all at once and want to change everything. And unfortunately, that rarely works.
Oh, been there, done that. Oh, it's you mentioned self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you get stressed out about the fact that you're not meeting your anti-stress goals. And it's
absolutely, yeah. And then you say, well, what's the point? I'm going to set this goal and fail at it anyway. So what's the point? And then, we don't move forward.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of what we talked about here has been self-identification, right? It's like realizing personally that, okay, there's some things that I need to change. I have a better outlook on my environment and in my personal situation. What about if we reflect on ourselves? We're in a good spot. We're managing our stress. We do have a lot of stress, but we're managing it. We feel good. We've got some good relationships, but there's somebody that's in our network, whether it's a spouse, a cousin, a neighbor, maybe it's a buddy that farms in another province. What if we detect that there's maybe some warning signs? What are some of those things that we can do to help somebody out that we care a lot about?
That's a great question. And one of the huge powers of our social networks. And oftentimes somebody who is struggling with their mental health or has a mental illness, they might not realize it themselves. Or they might realize it and, again, as you mentioned earlier, not feel comfortable talking about it. And so that mental health literacy, being able to know the signs that somebody is struggling is really important. So if you've noticed, changes in somebody's general affect, or you've noticed changes, not good changes in their way of their how they look, their presentation, or if you've noticed, the barn's not quite up to the standard that it usually is. What we recommend doing is when it's a good time, when you actually have time to engage in a conversation, it's not something you want to do when you're on the run somewhere else, is connect with that person and say, it seems you haven't been yourself lately. Anything you want to chat about? And that the person might not take you up on that right away. They might, which is terrific. They might say, no, everything's fine, and kind of brush it off. But you've opened that dialogue so that they know you're there and you don't want to shy away from the conversation, that you're open to having that conversation. So I'd say the most important thing is letting the person know that you care about them, and that you're there to talk if they want to talk.
And I think it's to finish off the conversation here, Andria, the reality is that this is an issue that does impact our industry. Our industry, this isn't a negative on the industry. It's being realistic that agriculture is a great industry that contributes immensely to Canadian society, the economy, obviously the food system, and it's okay to have these kinds of discussions on such an important topic.
Absolutely. And just to further that, we're also in our research seeing some pretty amazing benefits of being a farmer and being in farming as well. And this sense of pride and accomplishment that comes when you see what you're doing work and you see the animals grow, or you see the crops thrive, or whatever that is. So I agree. Agriculture is amazing. It's a terrific service to society. It also has some positive impacts on our wellness as well. And then there's the other side that, it's great that we're paying more attention to it.
Andria, thanks a lot for joining us here today on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast.
Thank you very much.
Some fabulous advice on today's episode with Dr. Bitton. This is not an easy subject, but a very important one that can only be addressed with real effort. Ignoring a subject like this can lead to years of pain and possibly even tragedy. We don't want that. When we are minding our farm business, it's very important to consider the mind and not just the financials. You can find more episodes of Mind Your Farm Business podcast at mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Thanks to RBC Royal Bank, and until next time, keep on minding your farm business.